Greetings once again from Cooperstown, New York, site of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum, as we continue our virtual programs throughout the summer of 2021. We're very glad everybody could join us today for the program. For those of you who might not know me, Bruce Markison, that would be my name. I work in the education department here at the Hall of Fame. I've been in this department now since 2013. I'll try to do less talking though, because we like to turn things over to our guests as much as possible. And today we're very glad to have with us Ralph Wimbish. Ralph once worked at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, was the assistant sports editor at the New York Post for a quarter of a century. He has authored 3 books, and he'll be joining us today to talk about his newest book. We'll tell you more about that in a moment. Before we do get to Ralph, though, I just want to briefly acknowledge our sponsor, the Ford Motor Company. All of these virtual programs that you're able to enjoy, either live through Zoom or taped, recorded on our YouTube channel, they're made possible through the generous support of the Ford Motor Company. Our guest, Ralph Wimbish, has offered the new book. It's just out in 2021. It is called Heroes, Stories of Sports, Courage, and Class. Forward by Phil Mushnick, another one of our favorite writers, at least for me, here at the Baseball Hall of Fame. Ralph, way back in 1998, somehow he remembered our meeting, even though it was over 2 decades ago. Good to see you again, Ralph. How are you?
Hey, Bruce. How are you? Good to be here.
We're doing okay. You don't look that much different from what I remember.
A little grayer.
Years ago.
A little grayer, a little older.
Like we all are. You were here, I believe, to do research for your book on Elston Howard, the first of 3 books that you did. I had a chance to meet Cheryl Howard, the daughter of the late Elston Howard, and had fun going around the museum with you and some of the other staff here from the Hall of Fame. We're going to talk about this new project that you decided to put together. A lot of books that we see that come out today, sports-related books, are tell-alls. They go behind the scenes. They get into some of the grittier aspects, some of the unpublicized aspects of the baseball world, sometimes the seamy side of baseball. Your book, though, is different. You chose to focus on baseball and other sporting heroes. Why this particular topic? Why this theme?
Well, I came up with this idea during the pandemic. There was no sports to watch on TV, and my wife and I had just moved into our new house, and I had all my clippings in front of me because from the move, and I said, I have enough material here to revisit some of these people, a lot of people who I really admire, that I interviewed over my career. And basically they're stories about stories, the stories that I've written over my career. And I just thought it's good material. It's very readable, I thought, and I just put it all together. And it's a tribute to the newspaper industry, to which I owe my whole existence to since I began at the age of 16 down in St. Petersburg, Florida. So from there on, it's just sad to see the newspaper industry fall off the face of the earth like it is now.
You retired a few years ago from the New York Post, but I guess like all writers, new or young or old or whatever, you never completely retire. You always have that desire to get in front of the keyboard and do something.
Well, yeah, I did a book with Mickey Crowley. He was a former Big East referee. He lives back he died 2 years ago, but he lived down the street from me, and he had all these great stories about his basketball career. So I ended up doing a book on Mickey, and that was my second book, and now I got a third one.
I want to talk a little bit about the cover photo, which is fascinating, and it's a story in and of itself. I'm going to identify some of the people that are in this photograph. Your parents.
Yeah, my mom's there. My mom's there. Yeah, go ahead.
His wife, and a gentleman that maybe a lot of people don't know, L.O. Williams, who was with the NAACP. The photo was taken in 1967, but I'd like you to take the story from there. What was the occasion? What occurred here?
Apparently, it was a NAACP dinner in St. Petersburg in February of 1967. I don't remember it. I just happened to stumble across this photo, and I have a friend down at the St. Pete Times who found it for me, and uh, it was part of the reason I inspired me to write this book. I mean, my dad was a hero, my mom was a hero, Jackie Robinson certainly was a hero, and L.O. Williams, he was a I think at the time he was the NAACP leader in St. Petersburg, and my dad had served in that capacity for several years. So it was just like the perfect photo to spotlight what I was trying to do with this book.
So this photo is 1967. This is only 5 years before Jackie Robinson passed away. It's only a photo, and it's not a close-up of Jackie, but he looks like he's in fairly good health, and yet we'd lose him only 5 years later. Tragically, in your father's case, he passed away later that year in
Yes, he did. Yeah, that was, I talk about that in the book also. I did, I spent his final 3 months, I lived with him while my mother was completing law school up in Tallahassee. So it was quite a shock to lose him at 45, but my dad was a smoker. He was always active. He just, I mean, looking back, it's not a surprise with all the smoking he did and all the stress that he was under that, a heart attack would get him at the age of 45, but it did. And fortunately, my mom picked up the ball and kept going.
How old were you at the time?
I was 15.
15. Did you have a chance to meet Jackie either at this point or somewhere else in
Oh,
your?
yes. In 1964, our family went up to Stanford and we stayed a weekend with Jackie and his family. And it was quite an event. I wrote a chapter about that whole little episode there. Yeah, it was quite an event.
Seem to have lost Ralph's
Yeah.
video, and we're going to try to hopefully rectify that situation, but we still can hear Ralph, so we're going to continue the interview. Your father, though he died very young and may not necessarily, be famous in terms of being, part of the popular culture, but he was a hugely important person in the history of St. Petersburg, the integration of spring training in Pittsburgh.
No,
A lot of
St.
people
Petersburg.
don't know the story of Ralph Wimbish Sr.
Yeah, my dad, being my dad, he was a baseball fan. He liked the Brooklyn Dodgers, and early in I would say in the mid 50s, he became NAACP president, and the teams, the Yankees and Cardinals who trained in St. Petersburg would ask him to find housing for their black players since they were not allowed to stay in the white hotels. So my dad did this for a couple of years. He brought home Elston Howard to stay in my bedroom, Curt Flood, Bob Gibson, Bill White. They would all stay they wouldn't stay at our house, but they were frequent visitors. So they would come to, we had all these celebrities come to our house. Cab Calloway stayed in my bedroom. I remember Althea Gibson. So we had all these people coming through our house, Jesse Owens. And it was just such a treat. I mean, I was 5, 6, 7 years old, whatever. But I kind of grew up learning who these people were, and I came to appreciate them much later.
I want to talk more about your father later in the program because you do devote one of the chapters in your book to him. I also want to remind folks, if they're interested in purchasing the book, and we certainly recommend that, you can go to Amazon.com and purchase Heroes, Stories of Sports, Courage, and Class, written by our guest, Ralph Wimbish. Ralph, I want to talk about some of the...
Bruce, one thing I just want to add.
Sure.
About my dad. In 1961, he finally said he wouldn't take this segregation anymore, and he went out and declared that he would not help baseball teams find housing for the black players. So that caused a big stir. It caused the Yankees to leave town and go to Fort Lauderdale. And the Cardinals did integrate their hotel situation later, and the Mets came in, they integrated. But my dad was he started all that. I mean, he started the fire there.
Oh, we're definitely going to pick up on that subject as we proceed today.
Oh, sorry.
I thought that it would be appropriate to begin some of our individual profiles that you feature in the book by talking about the man that sadly we just lost a couple of weeks ago. J.R. Richard passed away from the effects of COVID-19 at the age of 71. And initially, when I saw that he had passed away, I didn't realize that you had included him in the book. And then a few days ago, I was looking through the book, preparing, doing research for this interview, and realized that you did have a chapter in there. It's not a long chapter, but it's powerful because you had a personal encounter with him way back in 1979 in spring training when J.R. Richard was one of the most dominant pitchers in the game.
Well, it was 1979, right? And it was probably maybe my most memorable interview because of how it turned out. I was doing a story on how to pitch. I was working in Pittsburgh. I was doing a story on how do National League pitchers pitch to Dave Parker. So naturally, J.R. Richard was somebody I'd like to talk to about that. So I went up, drove over to Kissimmee, Florida, and he came out of a game in the seventh inning. I think he was pitching like 1 or 2 hitter. And I was the only reporter out there when he came up to the locker room. And I asked him for an interview. He said, no, I got to finish my workout, but I'll be back out in a half hour or so. So I waited around. By then the game had ended and I was standing out there and there were like maybe 20, 30 reporters waiting to talk to him. And he came out, saw all the reporters, looked at me and took me inside and gave me my interview, which I thought was such a classy move. He didn't have to do that, but I really appreciate that he did that, and I never forgot it. So naturally, I had to put that in my book.
6'8", huge right-hander, powerful. Were you intimidated at all before talking to him just because of his sheer size?
No, he was such a nice guy. I mean, he was very well-spoken. I mean, just a great guy, I thought. I mean, I've seen him I had seen him pitch in Pittsburgh, and he's very intimidating on the mound. And, he was a great pitcher back then. And I don't think he really gets the due that he should have gotten because, he had the stroke. It kind of it ended his career basically. But I thought I was of all the pitchers I've ever talked to, he's like right up there.
Earlier that day, you had tried to interview Bert Hooton.
Yeah, Bert wasn't too friendly there. He was a little resistant. I got him to say something, but he wasn't exactly the friendliest guy on earth. Don Sutton, on the other hand, I talked to him later that day. This is over in Vero Beach. Don was very accommodating, a good guy.
Yeah. I was going to say Bert Hooton was nicknamed Happy, and that was one of the of the nickname being the opposite, because Bert Hooton was rather notoriously curmudgeonly, if you will, not always the friendliest guy, especially at the ballpark, although he was a very good pitcher and had a fine career with the Dodgers. Getting back to J.R. Richard, a lot's been made of his post-baseball struggles. He had the stroke just 1 year after meeting you. That was in 1980. He did attempt to come back in the minors, but never made it back to the major leagues. And then after he was essentially forced to leave the game, went through some real struggles, failed marriages, extreme poverty, but then he turned his life around. A lot of people don't realize this. Tell us how J.R. Richard did that.
I think it was through God. He became very religious. He became a minister. He had been homeless, and you would see him at old timer. Well, I guess the Astros would have old timer games, and he rebounded. He came back, which is, I mean, he wasn't back on the mound, but I think he died a good person. Let's put it that way.
he became almost a minister, right?
He was, yes.
Yeah. And that was something that he was able to do, I guess, at least up until recently when he did suffer the ill effects of COVID-19 and was not able to recover. You said you'd met him in 79. Did you ever have a chance to follow up with him later?
No, never did.
Just the one time.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if he ever left Houston after the stroke.
Someone you did meet on more than one occasion is the man shown here, Curt Flood. You first met him in the late 1950s. You were very young. Tell us about that.
Well, he was Kurt Flood used to come by our house, and we were fortunate enough to have a swimming pool, so Kurt came over and did a lot of swimming. He was into art, and he and my ma talked about art and cooking a lot in the kitchen, which was kind of interesting. And then he gave me a couple of his bats, or he gave me one of his bats, let's put it that way. And I used that in Little League. And I did pretty well in Little League when I was 12 years old, and I used his bat. So I always appreciated that.
Of course, the Cardinals training in St. Petersburg for many, many years, and that's where you lived. And he would come over to your house. I mean, not just occasionally, but on a regular basis.
Oh yeah, I mean, it was almost like almost daily. I mean, a lot of these guys, Bill White, Bob Gibson, Kurt Flood, notably Elston Howard, they would come over and eat dinner. My mom would cook up. They loved her gumbo. My mom used to be a great cook. She made gumbo that they loved. So they would come over, go swimming. My dad would be inside playing the piano. It was quite a scene at my house back when I was 7, 8 years old. So I always appreciated having like these great ball players, come by our house.
What was Kurt's personality like? Was he a quiet guy? Was he outgoing?
Well, there is a story that Arlene Howard told me when I was doing the Elston book that I put into this book about how he had an affair with one of my ma's best friends. So the husband of the woman he was having an affair with came looking for Kurt at our house one day, carrying a gun, and with being the jealous husband he was. And Kurt was there, from what I'm told, and my mother hid him in my closet. Wow. And just think if we would have found Kurt Flood, I can tell you his name was Bob Swain, Dr. Bob Swain. Had he found Kurt Flood in my closet, who knows what would have happened with baseball free agency.
Yeah. It was later in the 1960s that Curt Flood famously took baseball to court, trying to take down the reserve clause. How much of a toll do you think that fight against the reserve clause took on him? Not so much in terms of his
it killed his career
ability to play, but his mental status.
Oh, it killed his career. And I remember watching a special on ESPN, I think it was, on how it affected his career. He left the country. I think he moved to Sweden for a while, and he got divorced. I know he dated an actress from Hollywood for a while. It was just a sad situation how his life turned out. I think he died, when was it? He died in 2003.
Yeah, and you wrote in the book about when you heard the news that he had passed away, and it really affected you, even though you had not seen him in many years.
Yeah, he was part of my childhood, and I just felt part of my childhood had just died, I just remember good times with him. He was always nice to me, which is something you always remember when you meet famous ball players and the like, Of course, Bob Gibson's another story I could tell you about.
Sure, go right ahead.
Well, I got spanked by Bob Gibson when I was about 7 years old. That was a day I'll never forget. But it happened. I was at a ball game with my dad, and my dad got called to the hospital, and Bob wasn't pitching that day, and my dad left me in his company. And I went in the clubhouse. I guess I made a big scene or whatever. And next thing you know, I'm over Bob Gibson's knee getting spanked. So, but that's if there was any bad memory I have from these guys, that was it.
Now he was, I assume, doing this in a kidding fashion, right?
Spanking? No, I got
No.
seriously spanked.
Oh, really?
You should ask Bill. If you ever talk to Bill White, you should ask him about that.
Really? Okay.
Bill, every time I see Bill White, he reminds me of that.
Wow. Let's talk about some people that have been very special to you, the Howards, the late Elston, and his widow Arlene, who is still with us. This was the first book that you did. You did a lot of the research here at the Hall of Fame, Elston and Me, the story of the first Black Yankee. You worked with Arlene, his widow, on this. Elston had died way back in 1980 at a very young age, much like your father died at a young age. Did you first meet the Howards in St. Petersburg in spring training? Was that first encounter with them?
Yeah, he came to our house and stayed in my bedroom. I got shipped off to my sister's room. I would say I was about 6, 7 years old when he first showed up, but he was part of our household for a couple of weeks there. And I was more than happy to have my favorite ball player. This is why I became such a rabid Yankee fan, having Elston Howard stay in my bedroom. And he was such a great guy. He would walk with me down to the corner and hang out with my friends. He wouldn't stay there, but he would come to the corner and, hey, look who's with me. I got Elston Howard here. Yeah. And he was such a good guy. I would show him my baseball card of him. And I said, on the back, it was a description of the catch he made in the 58 series. I said, Elston, did you really do this? He goes, yeah. And then, of course, I asked him for a Yankee uniform. I wanted a road uniform. I didn't want, everybody could get the home uniform. But I asked him, is there any chance I could get a away uniform with New York written over it in the flannel gray? And sure enough, when I was about 8 years old, I got one in the mail one day, and I still have the shirt, which is now in a museum down in St. Petersburg. So it's one of my most treasured possessions. And I told Buck O'Neill years ago that I would donate it to the Negro Museum, but right now it's in the museum in St. Petersburg, the Holocaust Museum.
Now, did Arlene stay at your house as well, or were they not yet together?
Well, Elston would come down early because of pitchers and catchers would come early. So he would stay at our house. And Arlene never stayed at our house. But whenever we went, I spent a lot of my summers up in New York, in Harlem, with my Uncle Alex. So whenever I came up to New York, Arlene would come over and take me to the baseball game with her. And I would sit with her in the wives section. And occasionally I got to go into the Yankee dugout. This is like 1961. I got to see, hang out with all these great stars. Mickey Mantle. My nickname was Mickey. And Elston introduced me as Mickey to Mickey. And he goes, hey, that's my name. So I'll never forget that moment also. I mean, it was just great hanging out with the Howards. They had a son, Elston Jr. He was 2 years younger than me. And then, of course, there was Cheryl and their other daughter.
Now, Arlene is still with us. You still keep in touch, right?
Yeah. I talked to her about a month ago or so. She read the book and she loved it. I'm proud to say she was one of my heroes. And of course, I wrote a chapter about how the time she took me to Old Timers Day and how she reacted and everything. I think it was just such a special day to be there with her, and watching all the players react and, their love for Elston Howard and her, of course.
Yeah, I want to go into some depth about Elston because I think his career is underrated, underappreciated. A lot of interesting things happened. There's also been criticism of Elston Howard. There's been people that have said he didn't speak up about racism enough. Some called him a yes man for the Yankee establishment. I personally have never bought that criticism. I think a lot of it's unfair. You would know better than me. Your reaction when you hear that?
Well, back in 1960, he was with the New York Yankees, and he was getting a World Series check every year. And he was not really, let's say, he wasn't like Bill White or my dad, for example. But he was, I mean, he was not happy with the situation, but he could live with it. It was not the best. I mean, he was not happy with Casey Stengel's platoon system, for example. Arlene kept saying, well, you should demand a trade. I mean, you could go play, you could be a star any team, but he kind of liked being the first black Yankee, and that he wasn't a boat rocker, as we would say. It wasn't his his attitude wasn't built for that.
He seemed to be more of a stoic guy who basically did whatever he was asked to do, worked hard. As you say, was not the type that liked to publicly complain. I would also say in his defense as well, it wasn't like today, where athletes, whether they're white or black, that play the game of baseball today, they have a little more power. They have a little more freedom to speak their mind. It wasn't so easy for somebody like Elston Howard to do this back in the conservative early 1960s baseball climate. I mean, how much could he have said? How much could he have done to change his situation?
Yeah, the person to ask all this would be Arlene. And we tried to put this as much as we could in that book. She was very fiery about this. She thought that, Bill White once told me that she was the fire and he was the ice. And that's an appropriate description of the two of them. Yes. So, Arlene was more of the catalyst as far as rocking the boat. Elston just wasn't built to do that. He was happy providing for his family, playing baseball on the best team ever, 1961 Yankees. So it's kind of hard to criticize him. I mean, you could criticize him, but I just don't think it's fair.
Yeah. It was about a decade later, and things had started to change, and he was a little more outspoken about Jim Bouton, the portrayal of Elston, which I thought was rather unfair in the book. And Elston came out and said it. He called Bouton a self-centered and selfish man, and he really did kind of speak up for himself. But this was the early 70s. That was a bit different than the late.
I can tell you, when we were doing the Elston book, Arlene told me to stay away from Jim Bouton. That was rule number one. Really? There was no love lost there at all. So it's just unfair. Well, I'm not sure how true all these allegations were in Ball 4. I mean, it's a great read and everything. I enjoyed reading Ball 4. But as far as Elston go, he was not treated well. And later, years later, Jim Bouton said that he was unfair to Elston, and he probably was.
I was growing up with baseball and the Yankees in the 1970s. I didn't see Elston as a player. I knew him as the first base coach. The managers would change, but Elston Howard was always there. He was the rock. He was the constant. Along with Dick Hauser on that coaching staff year after.
He should have been the manager of the Yankees. He could have been the first. He should have been the first black manager. I talked to several Yankees, Bobby Mercer, Fritz Peterson. They all agreed Elston would have been a great manager after Ralph retired in 19. Well, he didn't retire. He just quit in 1973, or he was going to get fired. And Steinbrenner according to Steinbrenner, he didn't want to hire the first black manager so that he could fire the first black manager. So that was the logic of the time. But Elston should have managed the Yankees. He would have been great.
That leads right into my next question. If he had not become ill with the heart problems, died so young, do you think he would have become manager at some point? Maybe early 80s?
After he retired, that's what he wanted to be more than anything else. He thought Yogi was entitled to do it. He should have been entitled to do
You think he would have been good as the manager?
it. With the team, the 78 Yankees, yeah, sure, why not? Yeah, I mean, he had that personality. He, as Bobby Mercer told me, he goes, you respected him. And I think that's what what you need to be a good manager is you need the respect of your players.
Still a beloved figure in Yankees history, even though it's more than 40 years since he passed away. Kind of tying into Elston Howard, your relationship with Buck O'Neill. You first met him in 1999. You wanted to interview him because he had managed Elston Howard in the Negro Leagues. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, Arlene and I went to Kansas City, and later from there we went to St. Louis, their old stomping grounds. But we went to the Negro Baseball Museum, and of course, Buck was there. He was 87 years old then, and I mean, it's like he's like talking to your grandfather or your favorite uncle. He was always full of just good cheer and good story. He would always have a good story to tell you. He was just such a fun guy to listen to. Just listening to Buck O'Neill talk was fun. And here's somebody else who why is he not in Cooperstown? That's another thing, particularly now that baseball is kind of acknowledging the Negro Leagues. Particularly if you're going to do that, he was like one of the princes of the Negro Leagues. He should be in the Hall of Fame.
What did he have to say about Elston Howard? Did he remember Elston very well?
Oh yeah, he said he told me about how. Well, here's another fact that we put in the book, or the first book, was that Elston was married to somebody other than Arlene before they got to the Yankees. And Buck told me how Elston introduced him to his girlfriend or his wife back then, and he was the one who pointed the scouts to Elston back in 1947. I think it was right after Jackie Robinson had broken the color barrier. So the Yankees were kind of looking to get a black player, and it turned out it was going to be Elston Howard. And part of the reason was because Buck O'Neill felt he had the mental attitude to become a Yankee.
Did you have a chance to have any follow-up conversations with Buck O'Neill?
Yes, in 2004, I went to lunch with him, which I wrote about in the book, and that was a treat. I mean, again, he was such a good guy to listen to. I mean, you just let him talk about Babe Ruth and Josh Gibson and Oscar Charleston and all these great players from back then. And then he would compare them to the players of today, or in 2004. In my case, in 2004, A-Rod had just signed with the Yankees. So he talked about A-Rod. And he was just a great guy to talk to.
I never got the sense, I interviewed him once. I was very fortunate to do a talk with him in our Grandstand Theater. It's 21 years ago. It was 2000. I'll never forget that night here in Cooperstown. And I agree with you. He was phenomenal person to be around, just always upbeat. Didn't seem bitter at all about what baseball had done to black players for many years, not allowing them to play. He could have been bitter, certainly. Maybe inside he had these feelings, but he never seemed to dwell on that, at least not publicly. Was that your impression of him as well?
Oh, absolutely. He wrote a book called Right on Time, and he explains his whole aspect of life, how he was lucky to be able to see all these great players and appreciate the game, manage the game, to do things that he did. So yeah,
Great Buck O'Neill. Another great figure in baseball history and another personal favorite of mine is Bill White. Again, I didn't get a chance to see him play because I just came around a little bit too late for that, but became very familiar with him as the Yankee broadcaster. He did Yankee games for the better part of 2 decades, known for his interesting relationship both on and off the air with Phil Rizzuto. He's a guy that you have gotten to know very well. You still keep in touch with him. Tell us about your first meeting, what you remember of seeing and meeting Bill White for the first time.
Well, Bill would come by our house and he was a regular. I mean, probably more than any other player except for maybe Elston Howard. But Bill, he was such a great guy. Or still is such a great guy. He would take me to the ballpark with him, particularly when I was, I would say in 63, 64. And of course, one of my best stories is the time that he got me to be bat boy for the Cardinals for a spring training game in which they were playing the Dodgers and Sandy Koufax was pitching. So that was one of most, I was 11 years old. Again, one of the most memorable days of my life being a bat boy for the St. Louis Cardinals. And I stayed in touch with him over the years. He became nationally, he was a Yankee broadcaster. I would listen to him as a Yankee fan, and he was a great broadcaster. Then he became National League president. And my wife and I went up to visit him about 6 weeks ago, and he's doing well. He's 87 years old, but there is somebody else who belongs into the Hall of Fame. I don't think he's gotten his due.
Seems to be a different personality than Elston Howard.
Oh yeah,
He
in
was
19
more outspoken publicly about the issue of race in the 1960s.
in 1961, he was right there with my dad when they decided to go after the segregation that was going on in spring training. He had a little dispute with the St. Pete Yacht Club, and he refused to go to their breakfast, and that kind of, he got the doors, he and my dad kind of opened the doors there. And my dad would call him up at night and say, he would call him and Gibson up and say, come on, let's go integrate a restaurant or a nightclub. And they would go out at night and do these things. So yeah, Bill was right there with my dad.
So they would almost do an experiment in terms of trying to get into a restaurant to see if that restaurant would allow them. I assume sometimes they did, and a lot of other times they didn't, right?
You would have to ask Bill if they ever got turned away. I don't think they ever did. I mean,
Really?
as far as I know. I mean, Bill told me all about this, that my dad would call him up at 8 o'clock at night, say, come on, let's go out, have a couple of drinks in a nightclub, or we'll go to dinner and see if we can integrate this restaurant. And I can't imagine anybody turning away Bob Gibson, Bill White, and my dad from a restaurant. I mean, the idea of that would just is insanity at this point.
I guess it was a combination of their status and maybe their forcefulness that sort of pressured these restaurant owners to let them in.
Yeah, I mean, they were persistent.
Yeah.
And my dad, he was very adamant when it came to integrate. I mean, he would take our family out my dad, every Sunday, he would take us out to a restaurant to eat. And part of that was the integration process. And that's something else we experienced.
You mentioned a moment ago his broadcasting, and that's really how I came to know Bill White. He was the first Black man to do play-by-play locally for a major league team. Later, he did some work nationally for CBS Radio. Has Bill ever talked to you about that and maybe some of the difficulties he faced as a pioneering broadcaster?
Well, he got it. I mean, he was very confident when it came to broadcasting. I mean, he had Phil Rizzuto to work with. And he told me back then, the Yankees weren't good when he started, which was 1971. But eventually when the Yankees got good, say around 76, he had to start doing baseball. And a lot of his early lessons, I guess, in getting information and came from Elston Howard. He and Elston became good friends, and Bill would rely on Elston to get inside information, what was going on in the clubhouse, that sort of thing. And that helped Bill become a better broadcaster also. Yeah.
Rizzuto was helpful to him in terms of making that transition.
Yes, Phil was very, Phil Rizzuto was, he was, if you're a Yankee fan, you love Phil Rizzuto. And his little banter with Bill White over the games, particularly games where Yankees weren't really doing that all that well. And then when they did do well, yeah, it was very entertaining to listen to the two of them. And Frank Messer was a good guy also to work with.
Yeah.
And Bill appreciated the
They
fact
would often
that
playfully argue with each other on the air, but I always got the sense they really liked each other. They were truly friends. And that was really the case off air too, right?
yeah, I think I start my Bill White chapter about how he reacted to the news that I was able to get hold of Bill after Phil died. And he told me all about, his how he worked with Phil and how he went to the hospital when Phil got seriously ill and held his hand and everything like that during the final days when right before he passed. So yeah, the feelings were genuine.
A couple of months ago, we had Marty Appel on this broadcast to talk about his career as a writer and working for the Yankees. And he talked about how Bill is pretty reclusive these days. He has been ever since retiring as National League president. Marty is one of the few people in baseball that he keeps in touch with, and you're one of those few people as well.
Yeah, Marty's a great guy, and uh, yeah, Bill is very reclusive. He kind of lives up in Upper Black Eddy, PA, out in the sticks, and he loves to go fishing. He'll rarely come out in public, and but I did go out to dinner with him. My wife Grace and we were out to dinner with him 6 weeks ago, and we had a great time.
Obviously, he likes you, he trusts you. Why do you think that is?
I guess he's known me for so long. I think he really respected what my dad did back in the early 60s. And for that, I thank him.
One final question on Bill White, and it sort of relates to what we talked about with Elston Howard. Do you think Bill would have been a good manager? I remember years
Oh,
ago
yes.
hearing rumors that the Yankees were thinking of making him the manager, and he maybe wasn't that interested, didn't want to go onto the field, into the dugout again. But do you think that was something that was seriously considered? Do you think he could have done that job real well?
I think he could have done that job very well.
Yeah.
That's something you would have to ask him about. I don't know if he was ever approached about being Yankee manager, but if you think about it, back in the Steinbrenner era, that was not exactly a coveted job. I mean, you get in there and your team doesn't do well, you're fired almost automatically. So I don't think he kind of would have liked that aspect of it. But had he done that, I think he would have been a great manager. Still has a great baseball mind.
I get the sense that he would have been a very tough old school manager.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think his playing career gets enough attention. I mean, he was an eight-time All-Star, 7 years in a row. He won the Gold Glove at first base, and you had guys like McCovey and Cepeda in the league. He was a very good left-handed hitter, and he just was never really appreciated for what as a player. I mean, as a player, I think he was a very solid player.
Yeah.
And then he went on to other things like broadcasting, and then became National League president. And he definitely had a social conscience that served him well too.
Yeah, very few people in baseball have done those three jobs: player, broadcaster, and very high level executive. And Bill White certainly has done them all. I want to spend a lot of our remaining time talking about your father because he obviously one of your heroes. There is a chapter in the book devoted to him. You mentioned that he was a prominent guy in St. Petersburg for many years. His job was not necessarily a glamorous job, the job that he earned money in, but he was, as you said earlier, very highly respected. Talk, if you will, a little bit about how he kind of moved up that ladder of respect in St. Petersburg.
Well, my dad was very energetic, I guess you could say. I mean, he was a ball of energy. He not only had his own medical practice that he took care of people, and I still to this day have people coming up to me whenever I go home to St. Petersburg and tell me, your dad was such a great doctor. He delivered me. And, that kind of makes me smile whenever I hear these stories. But yeah, he was a prominent doctor in St. Petersburg, and he got involved with social issues in the late 50s, early 60s, which was a turbulent time. I mean, from what I understand, I don't remember these incidents, but we had at least 2 crosses burned on our front yard. I've it was just such a time to be that prominent, and he didn't flinch at all. He would speak out against his big argument was that schools were not equal. The educational opportunities for blacks was not there, and he argued for that. He wanted more money for schools. Back then, Board of Education had been Brown versus Board of Education was okay, but it wasn't really in effect, particularly in Florida or around St. Petersburg. Also, I have to point out that before I was born, my dad built a house in Tampa that was burned down allegedly by the KKK, and I'm sure that had a lot to do with his activism. That happened, I think, in 1951, before I was born. So, yeah, he was, unfortunately, it kind of killed him when he was 45 years old.
One of the very interesting things in the book, and there's a lot of interesting things here, but you have an excerpt from local newspaper, I guess, in St. Petersburg, and you can see, hopefully, the headline, "Doctor Police Puzzled Over Cross Burning." And I'm going to read just a little bit of the article. A 6-foot kerosene-soaked cross was planted and burned in the yard of Dr. Ralph M. Wimbish, living on 15th Avenue South, here on Wednesday night. Police did not learn of the cross burning until early Thursday morning, although it happened Wednesday about 8:30 p.m. According to police, a witness saw 4 men set the cross in the yard, light it, and flee. The witness, a 14-year-old boy, said he told only his mother. Police said Dr. Wimbish was away in nearby Tampa attending a meeting, and his wife, home alone, did not see the flaming cross. Now, I believe this happened, before you were born?
Right. From the date of it, I think it was 57 or 58. I was 5 years old, but I never knew of this. I didn't know about the one in 1961 that was burned in front of our yard. My parents, they kind of kept these things away from me and my sister Barbara. They tried to bring us up. I mean, we were sent off to integrate schools at a young age, white schools. So I had that experience. But as far as the violent aspect of it, I mean, yeah, we got obscene mail, hate phone calls. I mean, yeah, it was all there. But my dad, and my mother, God, my mother was such a great, she was the perfect wife for my dad. I mean, she kept everything going. She was all, I did a chapter on her and how active she got. She ran for city council in 1969 and got elected. And she went on from there. But even before that, she was active. She was right there with my dad whenever they would go to school board meetings, church meetings. They were very active. And I appreciate the fact that they were.
One of the most disturbing things about the article, they quote a detective, Dennis Quilligan, toward the end of the piece. And Quilligan said the affair might be the work of pranksters. For anybody, much less a police detective, to refer to a cross burning as a prank. I guess that tells you a little bit about what it was like at that time.
Yeah, that's another subject you can get into even nowadays, how police reacted to just the old black versus police thing. Yeah, that's kind of what the times are like. Yeah, some prank burning a cross in somebody's yard.
Yeah, that really shocked me when I saw the wording from the detective in that article. Let's transition from there, Ralph, to talk about your father's role in helping to integrate spring training. Even after Jackie Robinson comes into the game, in the major league game in 1947, spring training in Florida and also in Arizona really remains segregated. Teams essentially have to divide up their clubs, either putting white players in the hotel and arranging for black players to stay in individual homes, or I guess in some cases they would have to find a hotel that catered to black citizens. So here you're preaching teamwork and unity during spring training, and yet the teams can't even put all the players under one roof. Um, how did this all come to a head in St. Petersburg? What was your father's role? I guess initially he tried to find housing for the black players, but then he became tired of doing that. Tell us that story.
Well, I don't know if he was tired of doing. Well, he probably was tired of doing it, but he just said that enough. He didn't want to be a what's the word? Excuse me. He didn't want to be an accomplice in the whole segregation process. So he made a big announcement in 1961 that he wasn't doing this anymore. He said it's up to the these clubs, being the Yankees and the Cardinals, to solve this problem, and he would not be a part of it anymore. So that raised all sorts of hell, particularly in St. Petersburg, because the Yankees left town because of it. And of course, we had a cross burned in our yard because of that. And I'm sure there were phone calls, hate mail, you name it, directed at my dad, but he kept going at it. And God, he was amazing. He ran he was a medical doctor who had regular office hours, and he was out every night, basically at church meetings, school board meetings, meeting with lawyers, filing lawsuits again. And he was an avid golfer. I have to bring this up. My dad was an avid golfer, and he would literally enter great golf courses. He would go to golf courses and try to play. Often he got turned down or turned away, but he was very persistent in the integration process, particularly in St. Petersburg. And he got involved with the baseball players, notably Bill White. I would say was very helpful in that regard. And they made a lot of noise, and that's what you had to do back then. You had to make noise about this. And my dad, I can tell you, my dad was very loud when he wanted to be.
So the Yankees end up moving out of town, but the Cardinals end up staying. And what was their solution, if you will?
Well, they basically bought the hotel. It was called the Outrigger Inn out near the Skyway Bridge. And I think August Bush, he was worried that there would be a boycott against Budweiser beer by black people. So he bought the hotel, or I'm not sure how he arranged it, so that this hotel would make sure, the Outrigger put in Bill White, Kurt Flood, Bob Gibson. They all got rooms there along with Stan Musial. And they became one happy family and won the World Series in 1964. So it worked out for the Cardinals. And the Mets came in, but the Mets moved out to St. Petersburg Beach. So they had a little different rules out there. And of course, they were able to accommodate their black players out on St. Petersburg Beach after all the noise my dad made. So it worked out.
Ralph, by the time he died in 1967, had Jim Crow segregation in St. Petersburg essentially come to an end, or were there still remnants of it?
You would say, I would say, yeah, there was still remnants of it. I mean, so supposedly you could go to a restaurant and eat. I mean, you'd have to go to the back door at McDonald's anymore. Like I remember early in my childhood, we had to do. But yeah, I mean, things were a lot. When he died in 1967, things were a lot better. Not a lot better. I would just say better than they were, say, 10 years before. And part of the reason was people like my dad who made noise about these things. And yeah.
Yeah, there's no question he made a tangible difference in taking a stand here.
Right. He that it cost him his life.
I would think that the fact that you bear his name, in addition to the fact that you're his son, obviously, it's a special source of pride for you, no?
Yeah, I mean, it's a hard legacy to live up to. I mean, uh, everyone kept asking me when I was growing up if I was going to be a doctor like my dad, and my goal was to be an outfielder for the New York Yankees. So, but fortunately, I was able to get into journalism at the age of 16, and that was St. Petersburg, St. Pete Times. So yeah, it's great having his name.
Yeah.
But I prefer to think of myself as a journalist, not a civil rights leader.
Yeah. Maybe you took the job that was a little more fun, and he took the
Well, the reason my dad, yeah, as a result of all the work and effort that people like him put in, I was able to go into journalism and become a journalist and write about people like him and other great athletes that I happened to come across over my 40-year career in newspapers.
Ralph, as we get set to wrap up, we do have a comment I wanted to pass along to you, praising you for what you've given us here over the last hour. This comes from Evan Katz. I believe Evan has been a regular watcher of our programs, and Evan wrote, "Fantastic program, great insights from Ralph, riveting below the surface baseball history." And I would certainly agree with Evan. Ralph, we really do appreciate your time being with us. We want to thank you for talking about this history, some of which is certainly not easy to talk about, but very important. Again, the book is Heroes, Stories of Sports, Courage, and Class. We have touched upon just a few of the many heroes featured in the book. There's lots of other people from other sports. There's Arnold Palmer, there's Muhammad Ali, there's broadcasters like Dick Enberg, fellow sports writers like Charlie Feeney, longtime Pittsburgh writer. Lots of good stuff in the book. Congratulations, Ralph, on the book, and we really thank you for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Bruce. Appreciate it.
Yeah, please give my best to the Howards, Arlene, and Cheryl. I remember talking to Cheryl quite extensively, especially about her singing career. She had famously sung the national anthem at Yankee Stadium, something that I recalled, and I
David Cohn's Perfect Game.
send my good wishes. What was that you said?
She sang the national anthem at David Cohn's Perfect Game.
Really? It was that game? Wow.
And I was there.
I didn't remember.
I was there.
Yeah, interesting. Ralph, thank you very much. We really appreciate your time. We also appreciate, of course, the support of the Ford Motor Company for sponsoring this program and all of our other programs. A week from today, we'll have another very interesting guest. His name is Greg Pryor, former Major League infielder, and he has a book out that's got an interesting title. It's called The Day the Yankees Made Me Shave. And we'll have to explain all of that when we have Greg on the program to talk about his career. Greg Pryor had a fascinating career. He was one of the players that was at Disco Demolition Night in 1979. So we'll talk to him about that. Thank you, Ralph. Take care.
All right. Thank you, Bruce.
Thanks, everybody, for listening and watching. We hope you've enjoyed the program today. Have a great day, everyone.